This is the brand new 2024 Harley-Davidson Road Glide, and it's got a whole bunch of updates for this year that trickled down from the CVO Road Glide that was updated last year. And look, there's some really nice tweaks here, some big improvements, so much so that I think it sort of changes my perception of where this bike is placed in the market. So in this video, we'll go through my 10 key favorite things about it, and then at the end, I'll tell you which bikes I think this now can go almost toe-to-toe with. But first up, look, we got to talk about the riding position on this bike, and yes, it is absolutely humongous, and that does have its downsides when it comes to low speed riding and maneuverability. But on the flip side, you know, being massive means there's lots of space, and so it really is exceptionally comfortable. I absolutely love the handlebar position on this bike. It suits the sort of attitude of the bike perfectly, and when you're cruising along on the motorway, this sort of mid to high rise, nice and wide, just feels super commanding and all day comfortable. Then you've got a seat height of 720mm, and like I say, this thing is pretty heavy, so that's nice and reassuring. You can get both your feet down fairly easily. And to top it off, big old floorboards, which mean you can move your feet around. So if you are trying to shuffle and change position, if you've been on the motorway for a while, you know there's plenty of adjustment in your riding position. Honestly, there are very few other bikes that I'd rather be on if I was purely riding in a straight line for hours on end. Now this bike now gets the 117 cubic inch version of their Milwaukee 8V twin, and it seems to get bigger and bigger each year, and probably for the better. Performance figures are up a bit, so it's 107 horsepower now at 5,020 RPM. And I always say this with the big American V twins, that might not sound like a great deal for this sort of capacity, but it is all about the torque with 175 Newton meters right down at 3,500 RPM. It's got that big rumbling nature to it, which Harley is so well known for, and that massive punch in the mid-range, which means that this bike is far quicker under acceleration than it has any right to be. Now naturally, with emissions regulations being what they are nowadays, this isn't a particularly loud bike. It is a bit strangled, but occasionally you just get a little glimpse in the ear of what it could be if you're just shifting down the gears and blip the throttle to rev match, or if you're at the lights and give it a bit of a rev, you can hear there's definitely some potential. Almost certainly the first thing I'd do if I got this bike would be to fit something freer flowing, and I think it would be a fantastic sounding bike. As for the chassis, well, there are a few tweaks for this year. You've got 76mm of travel on the rear shocks. You can't see them because of these bags, they're sort of tucked in behind. And while that isn't a huge amount compared to other bikes, it's still a lot more than the previous generation, and so it should be a little more comfortable. The other thing they've managed to do is shed quite a lot of weight, so 7.3 kilograms, and with that extra grunt that we talked about from this new engine, of course it's just going to be that little bit quicker, and also everything helps when you're at 380 kilograms fully fueled, ready to ride. I don't ride these sorts of bikes particularly often, so it does take a moment to get used to it, especially when you're riding at slower speeds. But as the speeds pick up, and especially if you're riding on some quite flowing roads, it does feel surprisingly manageable, and of course, less weight is always going to contribute to that. Now we've got this massively redesigned front end here, which we got a preview of, like I say, with the CVO last year. And I think for me, although this bike is always going to be a bit divisive in terms of the look, just because it's so big, you know, it is an improvement on the twin headlights of the previous generation Road Glide. But I think more than that, with this fairing, what the real effort's gone into is the aerodynamics, and they say they've used a lot of CFD or computational fluid dynamics to optimize the airflow, to minimize the effects of buffeting. And I've got to say, I really do think it has worked. On a lot of bikes that have a medium-sized windscreen, there are some days, especially when it's reasonably warm, where I think I'd prefer to be on a naked bike, just because the clean airflow is generally actually quieter. With this though, you've got a humongous fairing, which is a real luxury, and the way that they've designed it means there really is a very minimal amount of that very bassy and intense buffeting that can be really tiring over distance on the motorway. It's worth pointing out there are a few different screen heights, so if you are on the taller or shorter end of the spectrum and you don't find this quiet, then you maybe want to look into the accessories catalogue and see what they got. But also, do have a little fiddle with this vent on the top here, because I find when it's closed, you can feel a bit more of a vacuum in the cockpit, but if you crack it open, like I say, if it's a warm day and you don't really care so much about trying to stay warm, then there's a noticeable difference in the reduction of that bassy sound, and it becomes more, I think, high-pitched wind noise, which you can pretty much remove most of with a good set of earplugs. Genuinely, I think it's really very good on the motorway, and I think it's almost quieter than something like a Goldwing with the big touring windscreen fitted, which I found had more of that heavy buffeting, whereas this is really nice and clean. And I also quite like these little, I think they're called louvers, let me know if that's right in the comments, but these little adjustable wind shields on the side here, because again, this allows you to play with your temperature on the bike. They have fitted liquid cooling to this generation of the engine to try and improve thermal comfort. But if it is a hot day, you can just tuck these in and you'll get a bit more airflow to the engine and of course around your knees, and that's just going to help keep you that little bit cooler. Inside the cockpit though, we've also got a big change, and this is where this bike starts to feel quite a bit different to some of the previous generations. It's a massive 312mm TFT display, and it's about as big as it gets on the motorcycle market, apart from maybe some of the BMW Touring and R18 models. What that means is you get absolutely loads of screen space, and it means that you don't have to compromise on any of the features, and also everything can be nice and big and easy to read. On top of that, you've also got their latest Skyline OS, which I think is really nicely designed and easy to use. You've got a similar look and feel to some of their other bikes with TFT displays like the Sportecs or the Pan America, but just with all this extra screen space, it means you really can make the most of all the features and layouts. I particularly like the fact that it's white characters on a black background. I think it looks good, but also it's really easy to read, and it's another big plus for this update for me. I should also point out as well, it is a touch screen, and while you might not want to use that all the time, it's quite a reach from the saddle to the touch screen. So if you're on the move, you might prefer to use this really comprehensive switchgear. You know, if you do pull over and get the bike on its stand and whip your glove off, it is quite responsive, and I think it perhaps allows you to make changes to stuff like the custom riding modes that little bit quicker. You don't always get touch screens on bikes like this, but for me, I think again, just adds to the feeling of modernity. Now through this dash, you can now manage a nice selection of riding modes. So you've got rain, street, sport, and some custom slots, and each of them affects a whole bunch of rider aids, which I'll get onto in a moment. But look, while it might not feel absolutely necessary to have a whole bunch of rider modes for a bike like this, where you're not exactly going to be wringing its neck all the time, you know, it is a big machine, there's a lot of torque, there's a high chance you'll be riding it 2 up, and so if the conditions do get a little greasy, you might appreciate having that rain mode just to fall back on. Equally, the sport mode really does liven up the throttle response, and so you really can make the most of all that torque that this new engine brings. And yeah, like I say, the technology package in terms of the individual rider aids is right up there with the best now. So you've got cornering traction control, cornering ABS, linked braking, so whether you use the lever up here or the foot control, you're going to get braking from all 3 discs. Engine drag torque control, so it's kind of like a deceleration traction control, stopping the rear wheel from locking up if it's low grip. Cruise control as well, and then also all the connectivity features that you'd typically associate with a dash like this. And that, my friends, is exactly what I think sort of repositions this bike a little bit when it comes to the large capacity touring market. You see, previously you'd look at the Harleys as maybe a little bit old school and more so relying on the looks and character and brand as opposed to techie features and the latest gizmos. Generally, previously, I would have probably recommended something like a Goldwing or a K1600 from BMW if you were looking for a big cushy touring bike that had all the latest bells and whistles. And look, while they have, I think, still preserved the essence of what this bike is about, with that big V-twin, plenty of rumble, the brilliant looks, a bit of chrome here and there, that typical Harley riding position, the technology has come on leaps and bounds, and I'd almost say, in fact I'd definitely say, that this new dash is better than what you currently get on the Goldwing, for example, which hasn't been updated for quite a few years. So for me, it's a bit less of a black and white decision now between the character and soul of a Harley and the latest tech on the Hondas and BMWs. Price-wise, we're talking just over £27,000 starting for this bike, which admittedly is a lot of money. But if you look at the rest of the market, you know, the Indian Challenger Dark Horse or Chieftain Dark Horse, the baggers in their lineup, they're 26 or 27 grand as well. And even the basic Goldwing now, admittedly with their DCT gearbox, but still, you know, with just the twin bags, that's over 25,000 as well. So the difference is kind of marginal. And the only manufacturer that does really underprice the competition in this sort of market has to be BMW. The K1600B, I think, starts at around 21, although obviously the price is going to creep up as you add the accessories. And the R18B, which is probably their most similar bike to this, well, that comes in at 22-ish. But look, there's a lot of charm to this bike. I know that for some people the Harley badge is worth quite a bit on its own, and so if you're even starting to consider a bike like this, perhaps the R18 won't quite tick some of the same boxes in terms of the image and vibe the bike gives you. As always though, I'd love to know what you think of the bike, so do let me know down in the comments below. And would you go for one of these now, especially with all the extra tech, or do you think something like a Goldwing or a K1600 is still the superior choice? I'll also put on the screen now my latest video about the Goldwing so you can compare and contrast in a little bit more detail. And as always, do hit subscribe as well if you want to see more of the latest motorcycle reviews like this right here on YouTube. And massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next video.